Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Antagonist versus Villain. What's the difference? Is the antagonist always the bad guy? So often we use the terms interchangeably, but this practice can lead to confusion about the true function of the antagonistic force within a story. Contrary to common parlance, the antagonist versus villain dynamic isn't a straightforward equation. Although the roles often overlap, a character can be an antagonist without being a villain, or be a villain without being an antagonist. And the same is true for protagonist versus hero. Although many writers use the terms interchangeably, the truth is obvious. Not all protagonists are heroic, just as not all antagonists are villainous. In fact, as I often point out, it is entirely possible for your protagonist to be the most morally objectionable person in your story, while your antagonist is the most morally upright. We see this in stories such as Catch Me If You Can, in which the protagonist is a con man, and the antagonist is the FBI agent trying to stop him. This is an important distinction. For one thing, it allows writers to step out of the boxes they may sometimes feel they have to cram characters into. Allowing stories to explore morally gray areas not only deepens thematic opportunities, but also brings in greater realism and a more accurate exploration of life. More than that, making this distinction helps writers understand the true role of the functional antagonist and protagonist within a story. What is a functional antagonist? Here, we're talking about not simply the character of antagonist, but stripping it back to understand its function within the equation that is story. Basic story theory doesn't care about the specifics of your antagonist's personality or motivations. Story theory only cares about the bottom line. Is this character fulfilling the role of antagonist in a way that creates story? So what's the difference between the oh-so-technical antagonist and the oh-so-colorful villain? First, let's examine what plot, at its most basic, actually is. And that is a protagonist whose forward momentum is met by opposition. Usually, this forward momentum is the result of the protagonist's goal, or at least intention, and the opposition is what creates the conflict. Now, the antagonist is the opposition. In technical discussions, I often prefer the term antagonistic force, since this emphasizes that this opposition does not necessarily have to be characterized as a person. It might be the weather, the system, mental illness, or any other number of options. Any number of stories can be pointed out as lacking human antagonists, but this does not mean they don't still feature antagonistic forces. The antagonistic force is something that creates obstacles to the protagonist's forward momentum. These obstacles can be as simple as a flat tire, freezing rain, or a bounced check. Most of the time, such obstacles will be unified by a common cause, even if this is something as thematically vague as bad luck. The most direct approach is to personify the cause of the obstacles as a specific character, and this character is the antagonist. Often, when we think of the type of character who might cause obstacles for another character, we think of someone with malicious intentions. After all, if a person is the cause of that flat tire, the motives at play aren't likely to be morally positive. Therefore, it only makes sense that such a character must be a villain. Particularly when we create stories in which the protagonist is blatantly heroic, or at least morally positive, we often want to create an opposing character who can provide the contrast of immorality. Not only does this contrast make the protagonist more sympathetic and admirable, it also creates the opportunity to explore both sides of whatever moral issue is at stake. Plus, both characters can exist on a moral spectrum, ranging from angelic hero and demonic villain to characters who share more in common than not, such as with Leonardo DiCaprio and Matt Damon's cop and mobster characters in The Departed. However, because villain has no specific correlation to the antagonistic force, it's equally possible to see a villainous character who is not the antagonist, functioning either as the protagonist, for example, Alex DeLarge in Clockwork Orange, or as a supporting character who is not opposing the protagonist's forward momentum, for example, Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice. What is the purpose of an antagonist in a story? The antagonistic force exists to oppose the protagonist's forward momentum toward a goal and to create conflict. From this recipe, we get plot. When these elements are all thematically harmonized, we get a tight, well-focused plot. Without the antagonistic force to create opposition, the protagonist would be able to immediately gain the plot goal, and the story would be over. The opportunity for the protagonist to transform as a result of overcoming this opposition would also be over, which means not only do we lose plot, we lose character arc as well. In most stories, the antagonist's motivation will predate the protagonist's, creating the framework that forces the protagonist to learn more effective tactics for overcoming the existing obstacles, such as Katniss Everdeen overthrowing the Hunger Games, or John Dutton defending his ranch against developers. We also see it in stories in which the antagonistic force makes its first move before the protagonist is even aware of the antagonist as an opposing element, such as we see in A Few Good Men with Lieutenant Daniel Kaffee prosecuting a case for a crime that was committed prior to his knowledge of it, or Harry Potter joining a magical war that began before he was born. It also exists in conflicts that may seem at first glance to be initiated by the protagonist's actions. For example, The Fugitive features a perfect example of an antagonist who is not a villain. Deputy Sam Gerard blatantly represents justice, law and order, and an adherence to duty. He has no knowledge of or interest in the protagonist, wrongly accused convict Dr. Richard Kimball, until Kimball escapes and comes under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Marshals. Now, at first glance, this might seem like Kimball initiated the conflict between himself and Gerard. However, when we zoom back, we can see that Gerard's opposition always existed via the U.S. justice system and was already engaged against Kimball even before Gerard showed up as the personified antagonist. The Fugitive pits Kimball and Gerard against each other in a tightly woven conflict in which Gerard does everything in his power to create obstacles to Kimball's goal of learning who murdered his wife so he can clear his name. In essence, Gerard and Kimball are morally aligned throughout this story, both working in the name of justice and using only tactics that are in accordance with that principle. All that differentiates Gerard as the antagonist is that he is the one creating opposition to the protagonist's forward momentum toward a goal. From this, we also see how necessary the role of a good antagonist is to a story. Without Gerard's presence, this story would have lacked its intense through line, something the story's villain could not have provided since he was off screen for 90% of the movie. All right, so what is the purpose of a villain in a story? The villain is a morally reprehensible person motivated to act maliciously and with cruelty. The degree of villainy can vary wildly, spanning the gamut from Regina George's high school bully in Mean Girls to Amon Gert's concentration camp commandant in Schindler's List. The essential quality is simply, this is a person who crosses the line into social immorality. Not every story will feature a villain. However, most will, if only because a villain character provides the readers a more multifaceted exploration of the story's themes. The primary villain in a story will often represent what Robert McKee calls the negation of the negation, or the worst possible stance that can be taken on the story's theme. Because this negation of the negation offers the most blatant contrast to the story's thematic truth, which will ultimately be embraced by a morally positive protagonist, it is common enough for the antagonist to represent this most negative version of the story's lie and to therefore be presented as a villain. In this instance, the antagonist not only opposes the protagonist in the plot, but does so in a way that is morally problematic. This provides writers with the opportunity to up the stakes, since not only will a villainous antagonist use any variety of horrifying means to defeat the protagonist, but in facing the antagonist, the protagonist will also be facing a representative of a greater evil to society. There's little wonder we so easily conflate antagonists and villain. Villainous antagonists are truly effective in many types of stories. The Lord of the Rings could not have been so memorable without Sauron as its representative of true evil. Batman would probably never have become a classic in his own right without the contrast of the mind-bending sadism of the Joker. And The Hunchback of Notre Dame required its chilling rendition of the hypocritical and corrupt Judge Frollo. However, it is equally possible to utilize all the drama of a good villain in your story without making that character the main antagonist. For starters, you may decide to cast the villain as the protagonist, as you might in stories with negative change arcs, such as The Godfather and Wuthering Heights. You may also realize that, like in The Fugitive, the best rendition of the story is served by opposing your protagonist with a morally neutral and upright antagonist, while the villain or villains are represented by supporting characters. In this film, we can know the antagonist is Gerard by examining the structural through line, which shows Kimball consistently facing the larger antagonistic force of the U.S. justice system, which, by the beginning of the second act, is personified by Gerard at all of the major structural beats. The primary villain, however, is kept hidden for most of the story until his identity is revealed. And this is a spoiler, so you might want to skip ahead just a little bit if you haven't seen this. The villain in this story is Kimball's friend and fellow doctor Charles Nichols, whose hitman, Frederick Sykes, murdered Kimball's wife. For most of the story, even Kimball doesn't suspect his friend, while Sykes provides the element of immorality. The presence of a villain in what is otherwise a straightforward conflict between two morally positive men deepens the story's palette. It raises the stakes and increases suspense by adding that element of chaotic evil to the mix. So, which is right for your story, antagonist or villain? Put simply, the antagonist represents the primary force that generates conflict and obstacles by opposing the protagonist's goals, while the villain brings in the added element of objective immorality. Every story with a forward-moving plot must include an antagonistic force. This isn't optional. Even if your conflict is low-key, such as in cozy romances, the presence of opposition to your protagonist's goals is what creates the story arc. In some stories, this antagonistic force will be represented by a specific person who directly opposes the protagonist's goals, but sometimes not. What is optional is whether or not your story features a villain, and whether or not this villain is the same person as your antagonist. Many stories are furthered by the inclusion of a comparatively villainous character, whether a mean neighbor or a serial killer. However, just as many stories do not require a villain, and in some instances might even be damaged by the inclusion of a sinister or overly dramatic element. So what's important is for writers to understand the distinction of antagonist versus villain and to examine their stories to determine what type of antagonist will create the most effective and entertaining plot. There are myriad ways storytellers can craft characters with depth, allowing antagonists to emerge as individuals driven by their own distinct motivations, moral quandaries, or even senses of duty. Departing from the stereotypical villain archetype allows for narratives in which the antagonist becomes a vehicle for exploring shades of gray, challenging preconceived notions, and ultimately contributing to the narrative's richness through nuanced character development. All right, so I hope you will stop by the site and talk to me about this. What do you think is the most important distinction between antagonist versus villain? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.